Alright, very warm welcome back everyone again. Today we want to combine the knowledge about the compressors and the equalizers into one tool which is also known as dynamic EQ. The only problem with this is that we can only do so or only use the plugin we are going to use in the Cubase Pro version. So if you don't have Cubase Pro, you will probably not be able to follow along with this plugin, but maybe you have some other dynamic EQ plugins on hand you can use for this purpose. So I've loaded up another audio file from Soul Assembly sample pack here, chopped off the last 4 bars, and if we just take a quick listen to it while I'm also adding the frequency EQ, this is what it should sound like. Alright, so we have now the big version of the Studio EQ here, which is frequency, of course. We have 8 bands in this situation, and we also have different filter options that we don't have in the Studio EQ version. So for instance, if we look into band 1 and band 8, all of those have 5 different cut filters and not only one, and we also have the other 4 filter types that we also had in the Studio EQ. For bands 2 to 8, these cut filters are not applicable, but we do have all of these other 4 filter types. Also, you can see that we have the keyboard down here, which is basically pre-mapped to the frequency. So if I'm just taking one band and moving this around, you can see that you also have this frequency, or the node that this frequency would correspond to laid down here. Let me just quickly put everything to default values. And now we want to talk about this dynamic EQ functionality. So you can activate the dynamic EQ if you click on this little button, and then you have the drop down menu here, which brings up the important characteristics for the Studio EQ, for the dynamic EQ, sorry. And if you remember from the compressor video, we talked about ratio, we talked about attack and release, and we talked about this threshold. And this was not by accident, because these are usually the parameters you can find when you're dealing with compression anyways. And also in this dynamic EQ, you have these buttons. There is also a button for linear phase, which basically allows you to get rid of potential frequency problems in this band, but you will not be able to use the dynamic EQ functionality if you have enabled the linear phase option here, because you can see the dynamic EQ function is immediately grayed out here. You can also choose, and this is what we are going to do here, the single view. So you have basically all information for one band laid out here, and you can choose between the bands here. You can also disable them if you want to. And now we want to actually enable our dynamics. We don't have the linear phase enabled, so this should be perfectly fine. And if we now play back our signal, we see we have some metering here, and this is also mapped to our threshold. You cannot hear anything yet because we don't have any compression going, any equalizing going on. So let's just do this. Maybe raise this band a little bit. What do we have? 5.3 decibels. That's okay for my taste. And now if we add the dynamics functionality again, you should see that this little EQ line starts to move, right? And if I'm now lowering the threshold, again, think of this one as a compressor now, you should see that this line moves a little bit further. Also playing around with the other parameters means that this line will shift even more based on the ratio you are going to use and attack or release parameters. You can tweak those as you like, and also come up with this with all the other parameters, but you can also look at this start button. And what this basically does is it allows you to apply equalizing before using this dynamic equalizing or let's say compression part of this, where you basically have the start functionality which applies the equalizing first and then adds on top of that the dynamic portion. You can also do this in the other direction, so basically just lowering the parts here first, and then with the dynamic portion, shift them up again, or make the gain a little bit higher. So this is up to you, what you decide. Sometimes it makes sense to just accentuate some of these frequencies and then accentuate them a little bit more if you have the dynamic EQ enabled. But in some other situations, it makes sense to just cut some of these frequencies out or make them a little bit quieter, and then go for the dynamic EQ, not in that like extreme sense, but just to shift it a little bit in the right direction again. You also see that you have different options for the bands you can choose here. Maybe let me quickly put everything to default here again. And the first thing we have is basically the stereo view, where you have like you are working on the whole stereo sum of your signal. Then you have the left and right channels, where you can basically choose them freely and how you want to equalize those. And also in this case, the dynamic functionality is available as well. You can choose between the left and the right channel here, change the threshold and all the other parameters independently. And then we have the option of the mid-side EQing, where you basically have like the mid signal, which is probably your bass, and the side signal, which is just the stereo information, so to say. Usually the side signal is a lot quieter than the mid signal would be, and you can use, for example, the mid frequency band here to accentuate the bass frequencies a little bit, and the side signal to accentuate the brightness of your signal, so like the higher frequencies here. And also, if you do this dynamically, especially for the side signal, this can get to the point where you basically emulate some sort of stereo widening, depending on how much frequencies you have in the high end. So this is basically some of the applications that you can use the mid-side equalizing for. And I think this is the overview over the frequency plugin here, and also about dynamic EQ in the first place.